As we wrap up another week, the Carolina Hurricanes play their third preseason game against the Tampa Bay Lightning. Rosters have been announced. What does it look like? Who should fans keep an eye on? We do get some updates from Jaccob Slavin and much more on the Friday edition of Locked On Hurricanes.
You're Locked On Hurricanes, your daily podcast on the Carolina Hurricanes, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to the Friday edition of Locked On Hurricanes, your team every day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thank you to the everydayer for making this your first listen of the day, 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, talking everything about your Carolina Hurricanes. I'm your host, Zach Martin. I'm the credentialed Carolina Hurricanes beat writer over at the Hockey Writers, also the co-host of the Searchcast, which is a weekly Carolina Hurricanes podcast, along with all my duties here at Locked On Hurricanes. On the Friday edition of the show, we are going to preview the third preseason game for the Carolina Hurricanes against the Tampa Bay Lightning as they look to kind of avenge the 2-1 loss from earlier this week on Monday. Also get some updates from camp talking about Jaccob Slavin and his return back to full on-ice activities. Also get an update on Pyotr Kochetkov and much more from training camp that happened on Thursday. And then we get to wrap up with, more talks of early standouts for the Canes as we kind of, we're now a week through training camp going into, next week being the last week. And then next thing we know, it's regular season hockey. However, before we jump into all of that, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com and win $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Now, like I said, the Carolina Hurricanes on Thursday afternoon, evening, dropped their roster for the guys who are going to be going to Tampa for Friday night against the Lightning. So they got, Mike Riley, Ryan Suzuki, Alexander Nikishin, Josiah Slavin, Gavin Bayreuther, Willem Carrier, Bradley Nadeau, Amir Miftakov, Noel Gunler, Giovanni Smith, Tyson Jost, Justin Robidoux, Oliver Shillington, Kevin LeBanc, Joel Nystrom, Nikita Kwap, Bryce Montgomery, Gleb Trexoff, Skylar Brindamore, and Jesperi Kotkaniemi. Now, Walt Ruff did drop some notes about the current roster going into the Friday night game. With 3 games, this will be the third appearance for Giovanni Smith, and Ryan Brindamore has said that, after the game on Wednesday night, said he's liked what the tryout PTO guy has brought so far into the camp for the Hurricanes, talking about Smith. Of course, we all know 2 fights in basically the back-to-back games, 2 of 3, and he's racked up a good, I think he's over 24 penalty minutes now since coming to camp for the Hurricanes as a PTO. Bradley Nadeau and Kevin LeBanc are going to go 3 for 3 in the first 3 preseason games in terms of them getting chances. Alexander Nikishin, get another look at him. William Carey makes his preseason debut. And then they do add, he adds that, could this be a bounce back for Amir Miftakov? Because we all know what happened on Wednesday night. I know I didn't talk about it for the Thursday show because it's preseason. We're just trying to see where everyone's at, kind of looking at the takeaways, trying to see some more positives. Unfortunately, he came into the game. Carolina Hurricanes had a 2-0 lead, gave up 3 goals. Eventually, the Hurricanes lose 4-2 on an empty net goal that was basically bounced off the sidewall and kind of just trickled in. So 3 goals allowed on 7 shots. 2 of them were very iffy. So wasn't a great night overall for Amir Miftakov. If he does play, do we see a possible bounce back for him? Of course, like I said, the other goaltender that will be, participating in this game will be Nikita Kwap. So I'm curious to see how the German does following his basically 1 lone start and a half a game substitution from the prospect showcase. And the team in front of him, like you said, you get, the AHL regulars of Mike Riley, Alexander Nikishin, William Carrier. Then you're looking at Jesperi Kotkaniemi. So you really got 4 of the regulars of the NHL side, and the rest are AHL guys or PTO players. So it'll be very interesting to see how it works out. Guys to keep an eye on, obviously Bradley Nadeau, because he's been doing pretty well so far in preseason and in camp following the prospect showcase. I say Bradley Nadeau is definitely someone to keep an eye on. Justin Robidas the same way, because the way he's been playing as well, especially last year. Robidas and Nadeau are the two guys I'm really keeping an eye on going into, the 25-26 season with the Wolves. Even Ryan Suzuki, because Suzuki's looked really good recently. Last year he was healthy. This was like his most healthiest season essentially, but you're kind of taking into next year. So I want to see what Ryan Suzuki does. Is he someone that can maybe push for a roster spot that maybe coming out of camp, or at least one of the early call-ups for a center spot? So I would definitely say right now the three guys to keep an eye on in this game, it's definitely Suzuki, Nadeau, and Justin Robidas. Of course, too, I think Kevin LeBancs looked pretty good overall. He's kind of shown why what he's done with Columbus and San Jose and stuff like that. He does bring some different type of game where he does a lot of two-way. He's not afraid to throw hits and stuff like that. So I'm kind of serious what he can do. Giovanni Smith is not afraid to back down from anyone. Anytime something happens, he's in a scrum defending his guys and putting a little extra bite to the game. So there is something to talk about when it comes to Giovanni Smith. I'm kind of curious if the Hurricanes will go with a 1 year, two-way deal to kind of have him in Chicago, and if they need to come up, they can bring him up. So that'll be very interesting as well. Of course, you want to keep an eye on Alexander Nikishin, because he did okay, in the other night in the preseason. When you kind of want to see him, and Rod Brind'Amour said it, is to not rely on his skill and his free will moving and stuff like that. He wants calling plays, waiting for the extra little heartbeat, basically try to read plays a little bit more, be a little bit more patient. Because when I was there back on Monday for the for practice, you can see him kind of like trying to tell him to like, hey, slow down a little bit. We don't need to rush and stuff like that. Let things develop. So for Nikishin, it's him just trying to get used to how to break the puck out, call plays, read some stuff out, and kind of just be a little bit patient instead of just going, because that's what you do in the KHL. It's basically just a lot of run and gun type of stuff, where for the Hurricanes, it's, there's a way they want to break out and stuff like that. So I think that's something that to keep an eye on for Nikishin, is him just still getting, the finer details of how to run the system. But there's a lot of young guys to keep an eye on, a couple PTO guys as well. So it should be very interesting when it comes to the Carolina Hurricanes of going into your third preseason game, where you lose 2-1 on Monday night. You lose 4-2 after bringing up 2-0 on Wednesday. So now you come into Friday. It's your third preseason game. You got 3 more after this, and before it's October 9th. So, like I said, there are some guys to keep an eye on. I'm curious to see who the Hurricanes throw in net to start this game, because do you go back to Miftakov again and see maybe, since he only played one period, was it, those tough 2 goals, was him, trying to get used to North American ice for the first time again in a while, see how that works out for him? Or do you go with Nikita Kwap and, see if the German netminder can essentially bounce back for himself too after the prospect showcase, because we haven't really seen much of him after that. So it's very interesting for the Carolina Hurricanes when you look at the fact that you don't have Anderson, you don't have Kochetkov there, you don't have Primo, and you also don't have Kazayev. So you're going with your 5th, 6th goaltenders in this game against Tampa Bay on the road, with a very AHL PTO roster into this game. So I'm really curious to see how, if they're going to, split the netminders. Is one guy going to go for 2 periods? Is one going to go for the whole game? How's that going to play out? And I'm also kind of curious to see what the lines look like too, because like I said, you have a massive roster of AHL guys with a couple, NHLers. Ryan Suzuki is going to play center, in one of the positions. It's just Barry Cook and Yemi. Is he going to be the 1C? Is it going to be Ryan Suzuki is the 1C? Justin Robidas, is he going to be 2 or 3? Where is he kind of fit in with there? Where do you place, other guys within this? Is Chison Jost going to be probably on the wing? Then Skylar Brind'Amour is the center. How are the power plays, penalty kill setups? How's the defensive pairings going to be? So that's something that's going to be really to keep an eye on, just in terms of, who's playing where on the center positions, how are the defensive pairings going to be? How's the goaltending going to be up? setup. So it'll definitely be interesting for sure. And like I said, it's preseason. A win will be great, but it's kind of just to see, are these guys learning as camp is going on? Are they kind of picking up things? And who's kind of making a case to the Hurricanes, like, hey, I want to make this team come October 9th. So that's the thing to really keep an eye on for sure. Now, talking about training camp and recent updates, we did get an update on Jaccob Slavin. We also got some news on Pyotr Kochetkov and other things. So stick around, and I'll talk about Slavin and more camp news here in a second on a Friday edition of Locked On Hurricanes. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel is making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. It makes every game more exciting, whether you're watching your team or just keeping an eye on your fantasy lineup. It's quick, easy, and the best, but it added a little bit more energy to your Sundays. You're watching the Chargers, Panthers, Colts, Eagles, whoever. There's a lot you can do by just watching and having a little bit more fun in terms of watching your team and also watching your bets play. So that being said, are you ready to play? Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet. Welcome back to segment 2 of Locked On Hurricanes, your team every day. All right, so we previewed the third preseason game for the Carolina Hurricanes. Now let's talk about the updates that we got from camp, of course, courtesy of Walt Ruff. So there is some good news. Jaccob Slavin is working out with the first group. However, it's still with the yellow no-contact sweater. But the good thing about this is at least he's on the ice with the team, and it's better to have him practicing with the group rather than just having him off, because we've heard from Brendan Moore saying if they're not 100%, we're not going to push them. But if you're not going to play him in a game, I think that's fine. But I think if you want to get him through the practices, I think that's what kind of is good to have, that you're at least seeing Slavin with the guys and being with player, kind of going with the team at least through the practices. So it's good to see Jaccob Slavin somewhat back. Now, between him and Keandre Miller and Mark Jankowski, a lot of bright yellow no contacts and stuff like that. However, Jalen Chatfield still not officially back on the ice, and Pyotr Kochetkov was absent from training camp on Thursday, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. And with Amir Miftakov, we're talking about he is going to the game on Friday as one of the goalies, but he didn't practice with the second group. He actually practiced with the first group. Is very interesting, maybe because of the fact that Kochetkov was absent. Maybe that's why they brought him up. Who knows? Now, the lines that we saw from the C1 group, of course, it's basically I think that it's most of the non-game day guys, except for the couple with Carey and Kotkaniemi and all that, and Riley. But this is the main group there, kind of like the NHLers and maybe, a couple extra guys that aren't officially on, who's probably on the main roster, but, just bodies to have. Ehlers, Aho, Jarvis, that makes sense. Svechnikov, Stankoven, Taylor Hall on that second line right wing. Martin Uxtal, Carrier, Robinson, Kotkaniemi, and then Blake swapping with Jankowski. And then on the defense, Slavin, Walker, Nikishin, Gostisbehere, Miller, Shillington, Riley, Bayruth, and of course there's the three netminders of Anderson, Primo, and Miftakov. Now it's very interesting for me when you look at those lines, and of course it's training camp lines, don't look too much into it. It's not the end all be all, but it is interesting though for the fact that you go through the first few days of camp. Blake's been on that second line with Svechnikov and Stankoven, but now the Hurricanes flipped him and Taylor Hall the second and fourth right wing positions. Granted, it's one practice. Is that kind of, are you switching roles? Are they just trying to see how it looks? Are they looking for something different? If it's just a couple practices, sure, I can understand that. But I think with what Jackson Blake did last year, and I think coming into this season, I think you almost want Jackson Blake to be on that second line. You want to be on that top six, because he's someone to me who will benefit from a top six role, because you see that he can do it. He did it with Jarvis and Aho last season. He even did it with Aho and Svechnikov. So for me, it makes sense to have, Blake on that top six. Yeah, you signed Taylor Hall to 3 years, over $3 million for the extension. And I think he's not a bad guy to have in your top nine, or at least have him in your fourth line as well, because you are adding, Taylor Hall and what he can do to a roster. I think even then, it's not a bad spot to have him in no matter where he's at in the lineup. So that's something to keep an eye on. Of course, Stankoven's still playing the second line center. Kotkaniemi's still playing the fourth line center as well. So another day where it seemed like the Hurricanes are like still trying to, give Stankoven more reps and seeing if this is something they can figure out. Now, on the defense side of things, of course, Nikish and Gostisbehere are still working together. Of course, if everyone remembers the Wednesday show of Locked On Hurricanes, me and Mike Maniscalco talked about it, and Mike said, if you want to kind of shelter their minutes together, it's not a bad thing to have, because at least with Nikish, he can still learn from a guy like Shane Gostisbehere when it comes to, the offense and, or just, getting used to, having an offensive side to his game, but also kind of learn the system as well and not kind of push him too hard in terms of trying to figure things out. Now with Miller Shillington, that's an interesting, pairing to have, of course, with no Jalen Chatfield on there. They're just trying to figure out, left, rights and stuff like that. Miller with Shillington, not a bad option. Of course, Bay Ruther is on that 1-year, 2-way contract. He is paired with Riley, who I think is probably going to be the seventh defenseman for the Hurricanes. Now, the pairing of Slavin Walker, and me and Mike talked about this. We saw this in the playoffs, earlier this summer, and I said it as the whole season went along last year, I thought Walker was getting better. In the playoffs, I thought he was, probably one of the more underrated guys on the blue for Carolina Hurricanes, and I even talked to Rod Burnhamore, during the postseason about it. And he's like, yeah, he's one of those guys that does everything that you ask of him off the score sheet, and he's not talked about enough. So, and we saw a kind of a small preview of Slavin Walker together, and I think if you look at the possible pairs, and Mike said it best too, is like, if you don't want Slavin on his offside and you want Gostisbehere to be that guy who can predominantly be on his offside, Slavin Walker would be a very good top pair for the Carolina Hurricanes, because, yeah, you get that little bit more of that offensive from Walker, but that you've got Jaccob Slavin shutting you down on the left side as the greatest defense, the best defensive defenseman in the game. But the fact that it's a good shutdown pair to have for the Canes on your top unit, and you know what that role is. Then you got Miller Chatfield, who both those guys are very offensive, but both those guys are pretty fast. So both these guys can easily get back if they need to. Then you got Nikish and Gostisbehere. So I would not be upset if this is the possible top pair for the Hurricanes, if it's Slavin Walker out of that. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. Now, talking about the Pyotr Kochetkov situation, he was absent from practice on Thursday because he's dealing with a minor injury. Rod Burnhamore said that he tweaked something, and the team is just being cautious with their approach to it. And Rod Burnhamore even said, we're keeping him right out of everything until we think he's 100%, which it's been kind of the same MO for the Hurricanes when it comes to Slavin and Chatfield. If you're not 100%, we're just not going to push you out there, because there's no reason to push you, because we want you to be ready on opening night. If it's just a small tweaking of something and they're like, hey, we're just going to give you a couple days off, so be it. It's not that big of a deal. Of course, the team's practicing on Friday morning before they travel to Tampa to go play their game against the Lightning on Friday night. And then if he's ready for the weekend, great. If not, practice on Sunday. So that's just kind of the small update of the fact that Kochetkov was out, small tweak, just being cautious, don't want to make it worse, not going to put it back on the ice if he's not 100%. Same thing they're doing with Chatfield and what they've kind of done with Slavin, and even though Slavin came back on Thursday. So definitely something to keep an eye on. But, and with Juha Jaska still out with a minor injury as well. Don't know exactly what that is. And we don't know when the timetable for Jaska to come back. But that's kind of the small updates. A couple guys with their, couple minor injuries. And the fact that you still have Chatfield not really out there yet. And Miller and Jankowski still in their no contact jerseys. But Slavin is officially working with the C1 group, so at least he's getting some reps with those guys, be it that it's, not a full greenlit for Jaccob Slavin, but at least, he is with the group and at least somewhat practicing, so you kind of get a sense, okay, Slavin is on his way back. Now, that being said, who are the early camp standouts, even after a couple preseason games? Who has kind of caught my attention that maybe could be making some noise going into the season? Maybe, maybe some under the radar guys or guys who need to take a step up that are kind of impressing so far. Well, stick around. I'll tell you who these guys are here in a second on a Friday edition of Locked On Hurricanes. Welcome back to segment 3 of Locked On Hurricanes, your team every day. All right, so we previewed Game 3 on Friday night for the Hurricanes against the Tampa Bay Lightning, did some updates on Jaccob Slavin and other camp news that are going around. But speaking of camp, who are the early standouts? Now, over the last few episodes, you kind of heard me talk about guys that are kind of, showing themselves out in a little bit more of the preseason games, guys who kind of impressed so far through the camps and stuff like that. And I think now that we're a couple preseason games in, going into the third one, heading into the weekend and stuff like that, what are we kind of looking at for the Carolina Hurricanes in terms of your standout guys? Now, for me, Charles Alexis Legault has been looking really good for the Carolina Hurricanes, especially the fact you look at a guy, who could bring a balance to the right side of the defense because he's a right shot, right defenseman. Of course, me and Mike talked about it. Teams need guys like that. And the fact that, Legault has kind of put himself into a good spot because he was like 6'3", 201 last season. Now he's like 6'4", 215. Knows how to use his size well. Adding a little bit more to his offensive game. Finding ways to break up passes, disrupt offensive opportunities. And I think just overall, I think his game has progressed really nicely. And I think he's someone that's, he is a big boy, but he's someone who's got the footwork and he just makes it look so flawlessly. So I'm kind of excited to see what he can do. So I think so far, Legault has really put himself into a good spot for the Hurricanes that maybe if they need to call up a defenseman, I could see Legault being one of those guys to kind of, keep an eye on things. And then you look at the forwards, Bradley Nadeau is doing Bradley Nadeau things. It's no surprising. It's just, is he adding on to the other intangibles outside of his shooting? Because we all know he can shoot the puck. Ryan Suzuki has looked really good as a center as well. And I think he's someone that if the Hurricanes need to call up a center that, needs to take some ice or, be an extra forward, Ryan Suzuki could be that guy. And I think he's done pretty well. I think, he's had a very, underrated camp preseason so far for the Canes. I think he's putting himself into a good spot as well. So it should be interesting to see what he does, if he gets a call up, early in the season, or maybe this is later on, if there's an injury, or if, the Hurricanes clinch and they call him up. So I think if there's a center that they could possibly look at to call up from the Wolves at some point this season, I would not be surprised if it's Ryan Suzuki, because he's kind of, done what the Hurricanes have asked. Like I said, last season he was healthy for the first time in his career. He's not missing multiple games due to multiple different injuries. Like he stayed healthy and played really well for the Chicago Wolves, and it's really kind of, gave us the season that everyone's been kind of waiting for a guy like him, dealing with all the injuries that he's had over the last few seasons. So I think Suzuki's done a pretty good job. Now we look at the, the NHL roster, it's, who's kind of making some strides to put themselves in a good spot. I mean, we saw it the other night. Andrei Svechnikov was feeding a lot of guys. I think, we are kind of waiting for him to be the pre-ACL injury Andrei Svechnikov, because that's kind of what you're looking for right now. It's kind of him being that driving force, that power forward that you're looking for. And, of course, Jackson Blake had some great opportunities in against Tampa on Monday night, and someone who I think, as he, as we talked on Monday following practice, he wants to take that next step and, just be a better version of himself and help the team win. And I think he's someone who, did finish with 17 goals and 34 points last year, kind of going from the, don't tell Rod Brandamore about numbering the lines, but you're going from the first to the third to the fourth. I think if you constantly keep him in the top 6 and on the second power play unit, I think Blake is, looking at least 20 goals and hopefully 45 to 50 points this year. So I think, Jackson Blake is kind of really, he knows what it's like to be an AHLer now. He knows he's made the roster. He doesn't have to worry about making the roster now because he got that extension. He's put himself in a good spot. But he even said it himself, just trying to be a better player, regardless if you have a contract or not. And I think for him, It's just, you don't have to worry about making the team now. It's just continuously building, working and continuously working on his craft. So I think, Blake has done really good in that aspect of what he's done. And then, you're just kind of looking at, how's the defense looking overall. And of course it's the controlled environment, but you look at how Keandre Miller's done, and it's just, it just seems like he's just so fluid in his skating. It's just, he's got the stride, he's got the speed. It's just, you're kind of waiting to see him in, game action for the Canes in terms of the preseason, because, it's one thing to learn what's going on in a practice, because you're talking about practice, but what's he going to be like in game action? Because we haven't really seen him in the preseason game yet. And, are we looking at the 4th game of the preseason we finally see him, maybe the 5th? Because while practices are good, you kind of want to see what he's like against the opposing team, and I don't think you really want to have a guy you just brought in miss preseason games. So I'm kind of curious to see what, how Miller is when it comes to putting him on the ice and kind of figuring out where everything is at from there. But overall, I mean, like I said, there's some guys who stood out. We've talked about, Justin Robidaw, Bradley Nadeau. Felix Storm's kind of taken that next step as well. But you're seeing it from Legault, Suzuki. I would see even Dominic Fensori's been looking pretty good as well. Even Ruslan Kaisev. Kaisev, I thought, did a pretty good job at the prospect showcase, and I think he's kind of putting himself into a good spot as well. And he looked pretty decent against the Tampa Bay Lightning and stuff like that, during the showcases and all that. So, it's something to keep an eye on with him. I think he's right now kind of putting himself possibly into the number 4 spot and being on the main tandem in Chicago. Now, can Amir Miftakov kind of bounce back from the other night against Florida? We'll see. But I think Kaisev is kind of, he's worked on his rebounding. He's, putting himself in a good spots. His explosion is really good. Maybe, some people thought maybe he's going to start his, in Greensboro, or he might be the 3rd goalie in Chicago, but kind of look like he's putting himself into a position where he's going to be part of the main tandem with Caden Primo. So there's a lot of guys to keep an eye on. I think there's some that have stood out pretty well. Some are kind of surprising. And then, some are trying to take that next step. So it's just, who's under the radar guys, who's other guys we need to keep an eye on. But, so far we're 8 days into camp. If you're talking on ice activities, we're, going into Friday, we're on day 8 of on ice activities. We're down to, we're past 2 preseason games. The 3rd one's on Friday night. You're halfway through the preseason, and before you know, we're getting closer to the season. So it should be very interesting. I know for me, I know for some others, it's like, man, we're just ready for preseason to be over and just get ready to talk about regular season hockey. And like I said, I'm glad we're going to 4 next year, because I still remember when we used to do 9 preseason games. I'm so glad we're going down to 4, because after a while, it's like, your main roster, most of the guys. You're talking about some bubble guys. Do you really need 6 games to figure that out? So either way, it should be interesting. Hopefully the Hurricanes get their first win against the Tampa Bay Lightning on Friday night in Tampa. I know it's preseason, but hey, it's good to get a win under your belt before we get to the regular season. And then, of course, we got the weekend, and then next week is, the last full week of the preseason. And then before you know it, got some regular season hockey for your Carolina Hurricanes. But guys, this will be the Friday edition of Locked On Hurricanes. Thank you for taking your first listen today. For your second listen, go check out the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast, where Steele Roden and Philip Livingston provide daily fantasy tips to give you the edge over your league mates, all while making you a smarter hockey fan. Find Locked On Fantasy Hockey on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. If you want to keep up with me, I'm at OneTrueZach on X. The podcast is LO_Hurricanes. I'm also on Blue Sky at DZacharyMartin, where if you click the link trees in my bios, you can find all of my written content at thehockeyrares.com. I've been very busy this week, so make sure you go check all of that out. And don't worry, we have a lot more coming out over the next few days as we get to the lead up and the build up to the regular season. If you want to check my other podcasts, it's The Search Cast on all podcast platforms and on YouTube. For Locked On Hurricanes, we're on Spotify, Google, Apple, iHeartRadio, wherever you listen to your podcast. Make sure to leave a 5-star rating and review, because I might just read it on the show. For YouTube, it's Locked On Hurricanes. Subscribe. Hit the bell notification so you don't miss a show. Hit the thumbs up to let me know if you like the show as well. share with other Caniacs who become everydayers just like you. But hope everyone enjoyed the Friday edition of Locked On Hurricanes. Enjoy your Friday, enjoy your weekend, and hopefully we get to see the Carolina Hurricanes beat Tampa on Friday night to get their first preseason win. But until next time, as always, let's go Canes.